Alright, good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bouncert with our first pre recorded podcast here on the radio with Retro Future, where we're gonna be talking some RPGs with our guest DenizenRPG, aka Steve, and a Miskatonic librarian, a long time supporter of the channel and kind of my go-to RPG advisor at the moment, as we are developing our own RPG, Nightwatch, which is inspired by the Association of Ishtar, of which I am the author. So more on that a little later during the podcast, I'm sure. But let's go to Steve. Hello, Steve. How are you? And yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Bonsai. Yeah, I'm great, thank you. Enjoying a nice sweaty afternoon here in the UK. About us, well, and me, because I am sort of like the creative lead, I guess, of we are a little actual play channel. We're a group of role-playing game enthusiasts who decided to start putting our stuff out on YouTube. But mainly our mission is to enjoy playing role-playing games that aren't Dungeons and Dragons. Because we all love Dungeons and Dragons, but there's so many great games out there. We wanted to give them a bit of love. And we've been doing that for about the last 6 months. And I have spent about the last 40 years of my life playing role-playing games. So I think I have a bit of experience of different systems. And what has recently caught my attention has been a game called Tomorrow City, which calls itself a Dieselpunk role-playing game. And that's how I stumbled around and found you, Bonsart, on YouTube.
Yeah, it was. We met each other on what TTRPG community. That's simply what the Discord is named. I think we met each other on there. But something that I was wondering, because recently I stumbled upon the term actual play. Like, I know Let's Play. Is actual play the modern tabletop RPG equivalent of that?
I think it's a bit difficult because I think we're different takes on what an actual play is. And we kind of call ourselves an actual play. So actual plays can vary from pre-recorded games that are kind of highly managed, highly crafted, highly produced, all the way to almost live streamed role-playing games where it's warts and all. And we like to think of ourselves as somewhere in the middle. We simply stream our games and do the minimal amount of editing and post-production that we can get away with. So we like to present role-playing games as they are played, or at least how we play them, because people play them in a whole variety of different ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I recently heard about an article about the maybe Miskatonic can join in a little bit on this. The critical role syndrome, where people get into D&D because they see Critical Role, and then they expect to have like the same experience as the people of Critical Role, and then they become kind of like disillusioned with D&D. Maybe Miskatonic, maybe you are familiar with that.
Oh, yes, I've seen that problem plenty of times. You have what is essentially professional actors and actresses that have been doing voice acting for years, someone with quite an extensive budget and the intention to make this grand viewing production, rather than what the tabletop community is more about is getting all your friends together and having an adventure and escape into worlds of fantasy or sci-fi, monsters, machines, gnomes, and elves. And it's kind of a strange thing with the popularity that D&D has seen. It's bringing more attention into the tabletop community, and you get to see some of the other channels like yourselves that are doing games outside of D&D, and there is a bit of that, well, it's not like what this person did, or it's not like what I saw on this YouTube. And it's like, well, because not everybody has famous actor budgets to throw at this. Sometimes it's just for fun.
Yeah, and to my mind, our credo is we want to play what we enjoy playing and what's fun for us. If it happens to entertain along the way, we consider that to be a bonus. I absolutely agree with you, Miskatonic. Role-playing games about how people play them face-to-face themselves in small groups is about gathering people together, having adventures, and people play in all kinds of different ways. So some people like to put on voices. I do. I'm terrible at it, but I give it a go. Other people like to describe themselves sort of in the second or in the third person. Other people like to talk as their character. There are all kinds of different ways in which to role-play that are outside the way in which more established sort of like productions like Critical Role, which I happen to be quite a fan of. I really enjoy their stuff, but it's not for everybody. Just as D&D as a system is not for everybody either, but it certainly is something that when you talk about role-playing games is almost the first thing their minds go to when you talk about role-playing games.
I've not yet seen Critical Role, to be honest. I am watching another group YouTube channel. It's called Alpha Busa, and he's a kind of like animator. He originally made a lot of Warhammer 40k lore until Games Workshop nipped him in the butt.
Yeah, he did the Emperor's text-to-speech.
Yeah, and I loved that show. I rewatched it multiple times. And yeah, they had to end it, which was like their life's work, essentially, of all these actors. And they started anew, and they now do Vampire the Masquerade, Hunter the Parenting, which is about characters heavily inspired by characters from Warhammer 40k, because you know their voices are now completely associated with the characters they did on the Warhammer show. But yeah, it's a completely new story, completely new character relationships, and I'm really enjoying it. And they're exploring the world of Vampire the Masquerade, or in this case, like Hunter. I forgot what the
Hunter the Reckoning.
The Reckoning, yeah, and it's even further animated. So I hope they can keep themselves alive, so to speak. Because you know there too are struggling artists as it goes. With that, like Mr. Tank, you mentioned you met people who have like too much expectations due to Critical Role. How does that manifest themselves at the table?
Well, a lot of times it comes up when you're starting a new group. You get people, it's like at a local gaming shop or through, as has happened a couple times with me, bar leagues or something like that. They get there and they expect there to be a miniature for everything. They want these detailed three-dimensional terrains. They want music tracks.
Right.
And I do try to occasionally, when I have the time, I'll make terrain. I've made miniatures for people, but it's such an investment in a time sink, really, that you don't always get the chance to do that, because maybe you just want to play and you just want to have fun, and if you're spending 20 hours a week to build for each session, you start to lose the fun aspect of it. And people, they'll come there and expecting that, and most often what happens, as sad as it is, they see that, they don't like it, they leave and never come back.
And role-playing games, it's an expensive hobby, right? I mean, I'm sat here with probably £1,000 worth of role-playing goods on my shelf, and that's just to buy.
My budget was that small.
Well,
Don't tell my wife.
That's just like the core rule books that I have. I probably have more sort of like squirreled away elsewhere that I've squandered my hard-earned cash on, and that's just buying the core rule books, and then if you get into systems, like you mentioned, Warhammer is as well as obviously well known for being the space combat skirmish system, also has a fantasy role-playing game arm, and interestingly a steampunk derivative, Iron Kingdoms. You could just
Iron
be spending
Kingdoms
a lot of
was
money.
the role-play game for War Machine.
Yeah. It's really expensive just to get the basic kit before you invest your time into miniatures, creating handouts, props. I like to do all that too.
I don't know how other people's experience was starting this. I remember starting in high school. We've got one friend that had some of the books, and we had some graph paper and a pencil, and you're just diving into it with that. As time goes on, one of you ends up the crazy one of the group that buys every book possible and has no money, which is terrible when I'm also a librarian. So gaming and library, bad mix. It's one truckload when we moved all of my gaming books and such.
Yeah, my first experience, I started with Warhammer Fantasy, which is back then, that's like 30 years ago now. It was also an expensive hobby back then already, especially if you're a high school student. And yeah, then we encountered somebody who did the role-playing games, and my first role-play game was unusual in that regard. It was Warhammer Fantasy roleplay instead of D&D. We also did some Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. May have even have done 4th edition, I'm not sure. But
Dungeons and Dragons tends to be the gateway drug in this case. Many people start on it because it is so prevalent. I mean, most big box stores for probably even more than 20 years now have had Dungeons and Dragons core books in their book section. And you get into that and you start playing it, and then you hear about one from at a gaming store of, I used to play this one, and then you end up playing Legend of the Five Rings or anything from the World of Darkness or Shadowrun. And you just start spreading into all of these different games, which is kind of draws us into what we have here of each game gives you its own feel. Like you have the edgy gothic of World of Darkness. You have the punk of Cyberpunk, the whole
Mhm.
edge runner and such. You've got the classic sword and sorcery of D&D, but then you get into the more niche things like Unknown Armies, where it's weird, or getting into Call of Cthulhu for that sort of eldritch investigation, whereas what we're looking at here with Nightwatch is kind of that mixture of weird fiction and noir, where it's got technology, it's got unexplained things that aren't natural but aren't mystical, and it has that noir investigator feel to it.
Yeah, I'm very curious how it will work out. So I hope to get play testing started next month. But Steve, before we get into that, you wanted to talk in particular about Dieselpunk role-playing games.
Yeah, I did, because it's not an oeuvre of game that has sort of like come across my desk very often. I've played a lot of the other genres that you mentioned there, but also sort of like genres like sci-fi, so Star Wars, Edge of the Empire, Alien. I played a lot of One Ring. I played a lot of old school Traveller in its various incarnations, but have rarely encountered games that focus on Dieselpunk specifically, the sort of 1930s, 40s, 50s kind of genre. So when I first encountered a game that said it was Dieselpunk role-playing game, I was fascinated, because I've always loved steampunk type games, and there's more of those about, perhaps a little bit more well-known. But the whole Dieselpunk genre I've seen less of. So that's also what got me interested in the game that you were developing. And I'm interested in how role-playing game mechanics can complement getting that experience of being in an alternate history and in a punk, technologically punk kind of like world, and not get in the way of enjoying that feel.
Yeah, well, to get started on like the underrepresentation of Dieselpunk, because that's I recently made 3 videos on Dieselpunk, and one was like, why is Dieselpunk quote unquote represented? Why is there not a strong Dieselpunk community, even though there are people who identify Dieselpunk? Well, I kind of like, during the production of those 3 videos, I kind of came to the conclusion that, like, I'm still convinced that Dieselpunk is more of an aesthetic, which means it's more of a storytelling tool than something you can actually focus books on. However, if I would have to describe it, I would say that Dieselpunk is kind of like Star Wars in the past, and that's also kind of like the thing, because there's so much very similar to that. Like MechWarrior is very much in the vein what Dieselpunks enjoy. Of course, there are Star Wars games that, like so many Star Wars games, that already kind of fulfill that fantasy. So what you're kind of left with in the end, recently a new video game has come out. I'm trying to figure out the name. Nobody Wants to Die. And Nobody Wants to Die, I would say, is a tech noir, but it has a lot of Art Deco and streamline influences, Populux designs in there. So I'm kind of wondering if that might be the aesthetical future of the cyberpunk genre, because there are similarities between those, the period from which those aesthetics hail, and the 1980s. So yeah, I think that's kind of the thing with Dieselpunk as an aesthetic niche, is that it is so it's very limited in what you can tell with it. I used Wolfenstein as an example. You've got like the cyber Nazis, and that's kind of because of, like, the reason why I call it Star Wars in the past is because of the dichotomy of good guys versus evil guys. You've got, like, the Nazis have like all these angular armor designs, already makes it like hostile and evil, while and have a high contrasting colors, black, white, bright red, yellow. While the good guys in Dieselpunk aesthetics have like more natural tone things. Think about Firefly does this as well. They have earth tones, they have round designs, they have like baggy clothes, and the bad guys have like the stylistic angular clothes. It makes you think like, are the Nazis the proof we're living in a simulation? But yeah, that's, I think, the reason why Dieselpunk is such a pure Dieselpunk is such a rarity.
And I think it hasn't had the same sort of basis to go off of. When we really look at things like steampunk and cyberpunk, they've had decades of support material that led to the foundation of that sort of aesthetic and movement and ideology of narrative. Dieselpunk didn't really have that, because I mean, steampunk can trace back to some of the older fictions of Verne, Wells, looking at some of these weird fictions that eventually turned into sci-fis that eventually kind of set that basis for the era that steampunk is in and the aesthetic of the anachronistic technology. Whereas Dieselpunk, perhaps given that it is so close to us still, because speaking of my own grandfather, would have lived through the era that Dieselpunk anachronizes. In fact, my father would have lived, or not my father, but some of my other relatives that are not grandparent level would have lived through some of that era. So we don't have the same. We don't have the same disconnect of past to it. And I think that's partly why. Because when we look at the steampunk genre, it's the Victorian era, it's an older time, it's a different time. Or looking at the cyberpunk, it is the future, it's what could be. Dieselpunk has the unfortunate difference to it of, it didn't happen this way, it happened this way. We know how that era happened, so trying to do an anachronistic retelling of it is harder because people may have a direct personal connection to that time frame.
I think also when you sort of look at cyberpunk and steampunk, I mean, if we think of it along a kind of continuum, I would tend to classify steampunk as having a sort of relatively hopeful optimism, and cyberpunk more of a cynicism. And Dieselpunk feels to me like somewhere in between those two. It's dirtier, it's grittier. It has elements of both those two genres. But as you say, because it's relativistically closer in time and doesn't have those deep-rooted, established fictions to draw upon, I guess it's harder to...
Yeah, so it leaves this void where there's more creation of the narrative in the individual consumer, whether it be reading or watching. You have to kind of piece that together more in your head than you would with other genres that we have these accepted norms for.
And that's where I would argue that more postmodern role-playing games that are narrative-oriented, joint storytelling-oriented, like, for example, Blades in the Dark, where the ownership is on the whole group, not the games master or the game runner. In terms of what happens in the story and the world, there's this collaborative storytelling. Really lends itself well to the Dieselpunk genre because you have to all work together, I would argue, but you're best served working together to create the world that you're playing in.
Yeah.
No, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, for our system, I mean, I think we make a clear distinction between where the responsibilities of the puppet master, as we call it in Nightwatch, lies, and where the players get to insert their spin on the story. But yeah, there's also, for example, for the construction system that I have in mind, there's also a heavy suggestion of, like, you know, negotiate this with your puppet master, how much time you get to construct something, kind of determine for yourselves like how much resources it's gonna take, especially when it comes to steampunk. There is also, I mean, for fantasy overall, there's a high element of wish fulfillment. I think that's where it is distinct from, let's say, cosmic horror games, where, you know, you're kind of supposed to feel helpless because, you know, it's horror. The game master is supposed to have a high level of control over your game, and I think for steampunk games, and when I say steampunk, I'm talking about genre, not about aesthetics. That's a very important distinction here, and that's why I say, well, Dieselpunk, I can say that's an aesthetic. Steampunk can mean multiple things, and for those who are new to my channel, when I talk about steampunk, and I can either refer to a genre, I can either refer to a community of costume communities, or the aesthetics. And when I talk about, you know, the steampunk role-playing game, I really talk about, you know, the genre, and how that works. And for that, I guess I have to make a distinction between gas lamp fantasy and steampunk. I would define steampunk as cyberpunk in the past, whereas gas lamp fantasy is a fantasy genre that pays tribute to science fiction. I think that's a good distinction. Nightwatch in particular focus on the cyberpunk in the past aspect, and in that case you can also, like, in that definition, of course, the Dieselpunk genre-wise would also fall under that definition of steampunk, and that's why I haven't made any videos on Dieselpunk for such a long time, because I could not find a way to make it seem as a distinct thing from any of the steampunk concepts. But back to the fantasy aspect about it, and I mean then fantasy not as a genre but as a increasingly being called universal fantasy. I guess I also have to explain that one for a while. The universal fantasy is essentially the back of the book description. In this book you're gonna read about a woman who falls in love with a vampire. That is a universal example of a universal fantasy. And in this game, the universal fantasy would be that you are a clandestine operator in a alternate 19th century in which rifts to other worlds are opening up, which has all these massive consequences for this world, and you are one of the groups trying to how do you say this, kind of determine the outcome of that conflict. We are working heavily on creating aesthetics that match this altered 19th century, starting with the Crimean War. We kind of want to use that as a technological baseline, as it were, to determine, okay, what kind of weaponry did they have during the Crimean War, and then increase the tech level from that point on. That's kind of like what we're doing with the current videos on Devil's Island, which is a trilogy on explaining the background of one of the factions in this world. In the same case, you're also going to have to negotiate that with your game master, the players. Like, can we have such advanced technology in this vehicle? So,
and that's where you want a system that helps you to do that.
Yeah.
And doesn't get in the way. Like a game, like a more old school game, well, to my mind, a game who has very crunchy mechanics. Everything is all sort of like predefined, like games that were really prevalent in the 80s and the 90s. So I'm thinking RuneQuest, which actually is just really coming into a resurgence, where there's a lot of mechanics and crunch and it's skills, and they're defined. That would be a nightmare to my mind to play Dieselpunk in, because I'd have to do so much heavy lifting to get it to a usable point. I want a game system that's light but supports co-creation, so I can say, yeah, absolutely, you want this in the game, you want your character to be able to do this because, you know, that fits precisely with what we wanted a Dieselpunk game. I want mechanics to support me to do that as a games master, and not make me scurry to a rulebook or spend the next 3 days creating what they want and need.
Yeah, but did you want to add something to that, Ms. Katonic?
Yeah, I was just kind of step back a bit, and when we're describing what the Nightwatch is, to kind of steal from the BPRD, their old tagline of there are things that go bump in the night, we bump back. The Nightwatch is really more of there's rifts opening in the world, and everyone is asking what, whereas players and the characters in this are going to be asking why, how, where, when.
Yeah. That's definitely an aspect that we want that in the game, that players actually have to like figure out how their enemy works. They have a problem and they need to find the solution. For that they need to do like investigations. That's kind of like where we want to go the system eventually. Maybe not in the quick start rules that we want to have done by October, but definitely in the final version. But how I'm currently writing the book, I worked on the skills, for example, yesterday, and I really want to keep the rolls as simple as possible. So in our case, 2 dice, because we kind of are heavily inspired by the Savage Worlds system. That the game master can simply say, well, this is the target number that you need to roll. You roll the die, you roll that number, it's done. And you don't have to like crunch numbers in your head because you get like +3 bonuses or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So also, our skills are gonna focus on like, well, if you have this skill, you can do this unique feat, or if you have this skill, if you have a scope, you don't get penalties on long range shots. It kind of like they are either negate certain problems that you could encounter during a roll, for example, long-range shooting, or kind of like narrative elements of which the game master or the puppet master in this case can say, well, I use the example of a tower, and the game master says, well, you've got the climbing ability, and and you're an acrobat. Okay, both give you a +2 bonus, so the target number is decreased by 4 points, and you're also a contortionist. Well, the contortionist is not directly related to climbing, but because it's useful, I'll give you another positive point on the target number. So you get a +5 in the end, and kind of like treat it that loosely. Do you have any skills that could potentially help you in this situation? Yes, well, okay,
Yes.
This is directly beneficial to the situation, and this is not kind of beneficial to the situation. So you have like -2 and -1 to the target number, as it were. That's kind of like how I want to approach it. That's also all the additions to weapons are really, you specialize your weapon to the situation rather than, oh, this weapon gives you like this much to all of your dice rolls.
And what that really does is it takes a lot of that annoying, the old gaming term, the math hammer, out of a player's hand where they have to sit there and figure out what are my bonuses, what is all this, and it puts in the puppet master's hand to be like, all right, you've made your case to me, your target number is now this.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of that crunching, you just deep dive, like feeling like you're back in math class, just trying to figure out, well, did I hit something? No one likes to do that.
No, I really like that. I do like that. I also like, I don't want as a games master to be spending my time having to do math crunch either. So I like systems that support myself and players to determine whether they can do what they want to do and how well they do it. And I really like these days systems that mean that when they get what they want, they meet the target number and they ace it, then the player gets to determine what happens. And if they get what they want, but it's a partial success or there's some kind of a complication, then that's where the GM, the puppet master, the keeper gets to have fun describing what that complication is, what that extra nuance or difficulty is. So above and beyond setting how they're going to do it, having the control in the hands of players as much as the games master as to what happens makes it more fun for me to run, because I don't know exactly what's going to happen as a games master. So I feel like I get as much fun out of playing games like that as ones where I've got a lot of control over outcomes or modules tell me what should be happening.
And also something that, because you talked about like how do you kind of like optimize things for Dieselpunk, or in this case Steampunk, something that I really also wanted to achieve, and I think we managed to do that, is that in order to complete their missions, the characters are really dependent on their technology. So if they want to achieve anything, they need to like either acquire the technology or get the technology, and make sure it doesn't break. I could probably put a lot more emphasis. I don't want to put too much emphasis on stuff breaking, because I think that otherwise the game is going to become too hostile to players, because I really want a kind of on-land sea diving, where the environment is just so hostile that the players need to move in special suits, and the world has become more alien in that regard. Like gas clouds, stuff like that. But yeah, that's also one of the reasons why magic is kind of like a no-go. Really, man against nature in this case. That's also why I didn't want to have bonuses on player levels and all that stuff, where players can just, based on their stats, can overcome any challenge. That always has been a problem with me with systems like D&D. Of course, D&D's universal fantasy is that you are one of these like super powerful champions, and yeah, here I want to go for a lot more grounded feel, and you actually have to make sure that you have the tools for the job, so to speak.
It reminds me of something, I don't know, in a video game reference, if either of you played it, it reminds me a lot of the original Monster Hunter video games. To fight something, to overcome a challenge, you were going to gather resources, get them together, craft them, make the tool for the job. You couldn't do the same armor and weapon throughout the whole game, because different challenges required different things to be made and found. And that's part of the fun of the game, of you get to do this deep dive exploration of learning about your enemy, whether it be human or monster in these cases, because it could be people being monstrous. You have to learn about them, see what it is with them makes them tick to see, do you need to do something destructive or do you need to do something to like fix a problem that they're saying is a problem? And it gives you more options in dealing with something than just the classic, let's go get the most powerful X item, whether it be technology, let's go get a hyper advanced laser gun, or in D&D terms, let's go get the magic artifact and then we'll win. In this case, it could be, crap, we need to get this specific plant and figure out how to distill it so we can make a vapor out of it. Things like that.
And that's where I think you need games mechanics that that are really flexible, that can really support you. So, you know, if you're going with a game that is very gear oriented, then you don't want to be bogged down in list after list after list of item and equipment and how much it weighs and how much it costs. You know, because then it will rapidly turn into Dieselpunk, the accounting game, which is a very different genre. I think you
There's
want
probably
something
a market for
where there probably is. It wouldn't be me. But you want, to my mind, you know, I want something that's pretty light. I want a game with maybe sort of like a. I also don't want to be weighed down with how much stuff costs and how much money I've got too much. I'd like sort of a system that supports me with like meta currencies like credit, with
Renown, reputation, things like that.
yeah, with tags and labels for, you know, I want a modified submachine gun. Its range is near. It does rapid fire, and you know, so postmodern, more narrative-oriented mechanics can describe and give us structures around that. That means that I can quickly add in stuff without having to play a long lookup game or crunching mechanics. Yeah, so that, I think Dieselpunk games are much more doable because role-playing game mechanics have evolved from armor classes and hit points and hex-based movement into things that are more abstract and reliable and innovative.
Yeah, I think that's that definitely, and that also one of the things that I liked about Vampire the Masquerade. Yeah, everything is a lot more, as you say, abstract, so it gives you a lot more freedom to do all that type of stuff, where you feel more like you're telling a story rather than, as you say, crunching numbers. And I was in the early attempts at doing combat for this game. You know, I first had combat bonuses, but it kind of like ruined the balancing of combat, where you have to crank up the numbers of enemies just to compensate for the bonuses that players get. Yeah, another problem I had, like, it doesn't do anything narratively, and that's kind of like my problem. Like, oh, you can shoot better now, and now you can shoot betterer, and now you can shoot besterest. You know, what do those numbers mean in terms of story at some point? That's kind of also my problem, the whole number crunching.
And I think that falls down to, well, when you're looking at a game like this that is very much investigation, that intrigue, the deep research, all that, you're not looking for, do I succeed on researching this? You want a dialogue narrative going there. You don't want a role to determine everything. You want the story to go back and forth between the puppet master pulling little strings here and there to give you hints and push you on, rather than it be, well, my research skill is a 20, which means I can know X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, that's something like how checks are done in Night Watch. Like, you've got like your basic test where, like I said, you have a skill, and based on those skills, the game master will give you a target number that you have to make on either a D6, D8, or D10. You know, you roll the die and you can easily see, okay, well, you made it or not. No more number crunching after that. However, I also included, and it's more of a tip than it is an actual rule, is, let's say that you're doing a boxing match, and instead of like making one throw to determine you won the boxing match, you can say, well, we're going to do 3 out of 5 or 5 out of 7, just to name an example. Mm-hmm. Just to kind of like roll out the event, and people can like comment on the boxing match and add commentary to each successive or failing dice roll kind of feel. So, you know, it feels like an event rather than just one roll of a die, and now you have determined the outcome of an entire contest.
I think it's really hard and a sign of a really good game system. People can let go of the game mechanics and just focus on what their characters or don't do. So, like, almost inevitably, every game I've played in the last 40 odd years of gaming experience devolves into people talking in game speech. So I've got a 20% chance of doing this. I'm going to use this modifier, that modifier. For me, that really takes away from immersion. That what I want out of a role-playing game is to feel that I am part of that action, that scene, I'm in that place. I really like the immersive quality of role-playing games. So role-playing game systems that can get out of the way and enable us to talk about, yes, I managed to grapple that person down to the ground and I administer the truth serum and I can see, and then the game master comes in, yes, you do, and the person succumbs to the flow of that hypnotic agent and they start to babble their plans. If we could be talking like that in our games rather than I've got +1 to do this, -3 to do that, that's what I mean about systems that support and then get the hell out of the way.
And
I think it's difficult.
That was a point we talked a lot with the designer we're working with. We talked a lot with him on, we didn't want there to be rules for everything because in this idea of a strong narrative where it is, again, I keep bringing up the term noir, where there is those moments of tension is where we want those rules to be. So this moment of, is it going to work? Is it going to work?
Yeah.
You want to use those we want those in those perfect situations where you don't know if something will work and that dice is going to give you that choice and chance little hit of like adrenaline.
Yeah. Yeah, well, then I watch, like I said, I watched the guys Alpha Brusa's channel and Hunter the Parenting, and right now they're doing the also a new series called the Norfolk Wizard Game. And it's basically they do like one-on-one sessions with players in the first few episodes, kind of like introducing their characters. And it's very fun how they play because they really play in like a narrative in a very narrative way, and they do make checks, but how they kind of like guide each other through that process of one-on-one role playing is really fun. I also like the productions levels. Like it's they're not using tabletops. It's all just kind of like how we're doing the podcast at the moment. But yeah, I found that very inspiring, and that's kind of like also what I want to see in the game as well. Right now, how I'm making the combat rules, I kind of do it with a focus on miniatures, especially with the fortune card system that we are creating. But I mean, it shouldn't have to. You should be able to do it without. So, yeah, I'm very curious how that will all turn out. I think the combat system is almost ready for play testing, so I'm really looking forward to what people will do with that. And yeah.
Oh, I love playtesting combat mechanics. So I'm well up for having a fiddle with some combat mechanics, Bonsar. If you can get, I think one of the best narrative systems out there that is, some of the 2D20 games have really done well in terms of supporting you to be creative by being abstract in the game mechanics. Like Dune, I think is highly underrated as a role-playing game because it really gives you so much flexibility over what you can do.
Okay.
But I think old school gamers and gamers have come from a lot of D&D background find it hard to get their heads into more abstract systems.
Yeah,
but they really get. But those kinds of game mechanics can really afford good story and immersive storytelling, and that to me is the promise that Dieselpunk has. Trying to imagine what it would be like to be, I don't know, a scientist with a 1950s feel to them, who is trying to establish themselves in a 1984 style setting. I think George Orwell, we were talking about sort of there not being great inspirations for Dieselpunk, but there is some stuff like 1984 George Orwell, for example, and maybe things like Raymond Chandler and The Big Sleep and
Yeah, I still need to watch that.
those kind of stories. Yeah, that trying to imagine being a scientist who is under surveillance, that the management of his projects is all um, under the control of a dark ministry or council. So you really want game mechanics to be flexible to enable that to happen and not jar you out of thinking along those kind of lines.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me, a good example I remember playing some years back, some friends introduced me to the game Barbarians of Lemuria, the Conan
yes.
Barbarian RPG.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fantasy lover as much as sci-fi, and I feel that game had the best treatment of how do you do magic. Because its magic system was, okay, you have to perform the magic. It can have one of these 6 effects of bonus, penalty, damage, healing, this. Say what it does each time. You did magic. Now what's it doing this time? You did magic against the enemy. Did you do it to hurt them, hinder them? And it gives you just the frame to build your structure of that action on. And I think that's a great way to look at these sorts of more in-depth games of heavier focus on the story as a collaboration. So it's like, okay, you want to build a machine to deal with this. What are you building? You're not saying, are you going to build cart A, cart B, cart C from book? We want to give those baseline statistics so the game master can at a glance see, okay, they're going to need to make something along these lines, and then people can just go hog wild with what they're doing.
Yeah, that's kind of like what I'm looking for with our construction system. I've got, I think, the foundation down, and because I do want to have like that the players actually have to manage their time. Also kind of like have a like deadline, so they cannot like keep building and building and building until they've got like this super deluxe like Cadillac with, I don't know, ray guns or something. But yeah, I'm kind of like on the components, like how far and deep are we gonna go with that? And so that's something that we still need to look at. But I've got the foundation. I think it's now, getting down to the components without completely like making something completely that only the neurodivergent can enjoy. So that's going to be a challenge, but I think I've got the foundation.
You see, it's kind of set up in that the sort of way where you could do the old trick. I don't know if you ever did this in your World of Darkness games, but making sure you have a package of white burning Roman candles for your hunter and the Hunt of the Reckoning, because they use phosphorus for that, so you can use that Roman candle to fight a vampire. Just taking those random things of creative problem solving rather than stat bulking.
Indeed.
And with some of your mechanics of looking at the realism versus the more superstitiousism of there's these horrors of rifts in the multiverse, understanding existence in such a grander scale, the person that deals with that might become more logical, more scientific. If there has to be an explanation, they could become more esoteric. They could become more, I hate to say spiritual is not quite right, but more open to things that don't make sense. And that's going to give more of those unique paths of solving the solution. Of somebody that's gotten a little superstitious might dig through old tomes and say, well, this resembles this creature from myth, and they said that these herbs would ward you against it. And those herbs could have a scientific reason for it, and they don't know about it. They're just going with superstition. Or it could be the scientist going through and doing tests and building it up, and you have those different routes to come to the solution of fighting whatever the problem is. And it can create tension within the party and give the ability for the party to almost puppet master itself, because that's when you've got a really good game going where the storyteller or the game master can sit back and watch it happen. and just interject bits and pieces there because the players have fueled off of each other so much.
Oh yeah, definitely. I want to definitely also have like cooperation that players can assist each other, especially in the construction setting. It's gonna be some scheduling work, but it's a construction project. You should be scheduling stuff, but pen and paper and work on that project on what you can put on there in a reasonably amount of time. Because it should be an event. It shouldn't be like one roll of the die and now you've got a tank. I definitely want there to be like this A-team scene during every mission where they're constructing some kind of like strange device. Does anyone still remember the A-team? Anyway, but yeah, that's...
Yeah. Well,
I pity the fool who doesn't.
I'm also thinking like a Firefly or in the Serenity movie where they're actually there refitting the ship multiple times. Like you're looking at these montages for them to show, oh, progress of time. In this setting, we'd be able to actually have some interest in them. It's like, okay, well, you can put the gun on there, but that's going to disbalance in here. What do you want to do with that? You can go deep dive into it, or with this open framework, you can pull back a bit if your players aren't enjoying that, to pull back to okay, you can put the guns on it and do this, and you're going to have to use up this much of your time resource, which maybe that's something we should probably bring up on, sort of the importance of time for this setting.
Yeah, I was, as a matter of fact, I was just looking for it. Yeah, I think I found it. I think I can quickly share it in our chat there. And yeah, also something that we've done because it's kind of like a multiverse setting. I don't want to put too much emphasis on the multiverse aspect of it in the first game version, but definitely in the latter ones, where you're dealing with technologies from other worlds. In the combat trade section, I actually included things like weapons that don't have iron sights because they're not meant to be used that way. So stuff like that. But yeah, it's there's going to be a lot of stuff you just cannot construct unless you have like very specific technological perks. So for our game, we basically use level 4, which represents industrial age technology as a baseline. Then we have level 5, which is kind of like, well, the electronic era, I call it here, which is kind of like 1980s, 1990s, somewhere around that time in terms of technology. Yeah, and also level 6, but level 6 in this context is kind of like very faction-specific technology, like or Steampunk mechs and the hazard suits that the Knights of Avalon wear, but yeah, then we're gonna go into the whole factions. I think what people in particular are going to enjoy about the setting is just a massive amount of lore that already exists, and the fact that we're just still expanding it, and there's so much still to explore. So I'm very curious if people are gonna make use of that during their games.
Part of what I was bringing up with that expansive world, you brought up the multiverse thing, but bringing up the ideas of Traveler's Decay and things like that. And that's where I think every game kind of has different things of like unique resources you manage. But being able in this, the Traveler's Decay, if you want to explain that, Bonsard.
Yeah, so the idea and also the reason why this world has not been conquered by alien forces yet is because in this multiverse there's something called Traveler's Decay, which means that if you leave your plane of existence, your home world, so to speak, for another plane, you slowly start falling apart. In the first few weeks you will not notice this, but after 2 or so weeks you will definitely notice it. However, this also goes for any technology that you bring along, especially very advanced and thus vulnerable technology is gonna break very quickly due to this effect. One of the reasons that the technology that aliens use in this world is pretty low tech in comparison to what they're actually capable of is because of Traveler's Decay. However, it also works that, if you are an associate with a very advanced technology, you cannot take that machine into like a Bronze Age setting and start conquering it because of that. It is a system that has a lot of brings a lot of story potential because every alien race that you invent that wants to invade this world needs to have like all kinds of proxies, like either cults or specially built automatons or special agents or whatever. They all must have some kind of system that they use in order to move over the world of Atlas, which is the code name of this version of Earth.
And how that kind of relates into the game, how we were talking about time is an important resource here. That is for both items and people. So if you have a mission where, okay, we've got to go into this rift and figure out why these creatures coming through it are sticking around. From the moment you step through, everything you're holding in yourself is on a timer. You're on a countdown. So really looking at how players spend the resource of time, because having played enough games, you've probably seen where it's like, okay, what's the downtime? 2 or 3 sentences of what's our downtime? Okay. In here, that downtime is still active and an important finite resource.
Yeah, I mean, it can play into your missions in various ways. Maybe you need to escort a VIP to a rift as soon as possible. Maybe you must arrest a VIP before he falls apart so you can interrogate him. Maybe you want to investigate a particular creature because of, I don't know, some important genetic factor or a cure or whatever. But yeah, those creatures also fall apart. One thing that I'm playing a lot with now in terms of biology is that creatures use, what did I want to say? Yeah, forms of is it called crystallization?
Chrysalis or metamorphosis.
Yes, true metamorphosis to create a permanent presence on a world. So you only have a certain amount of time before like eggs start to hatch, for example, of creatures that will not leave once they've hatched. So yeah, I'm trying to come up with all kinds of biology of like how these creatures procreate once they get through a rift. Another thing that I kinda want to popularize in the setting is that once animals come to a rift, they become far more aggressive than they would actually be on their home plane. A benign herbivore that would be very easygoing on its home plane would become extremely aggressive on Atlas due to, again, Traveler's Decay.
You know, game systems have come a long way in terms of sort of like managing time or representing time in role-playing games. It's interesting that you consider using it as a sort of light focus. I mean, game systems like Traveller, for example, given that they have to try and capture playing in a universe that is just so massive, has worked hard to incorporate time meaningfully into its game system. Blades in the Dark is another game system where you set up a clock, the GM decides how many segments there are, the player decides what they do in order to meet those stages and get that clock filled, and that kind of mechanic I'm coming around to more and more and more, because Tomorrow City does the same, you know, a sort of like a build-up of pressure that's triggered when it gets to a certain point, then something else or something new happens. So I like your idea of taking time and using that as an important element, and it's something that game mechanics these days I think do a lot better than we used to get in 80s based games and 70s based games.
Yeah, I mean that was also like the Wild West of RPGs, right? I mean, when was D&D conceived? Like 1970s. So yeah. And also, I mean, through the internet, I mean, we can so easily share ideas now, and also how the gaming industry itself deals with, well, with the exception of Wizards of the Coast. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. You know.
Move rapidly on.
Yeah.
Don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, let's just keep that elephant in the other room. Anyways, moving on.
But you know, like Savage Worlds deals with it. You know, I'm still I'm not sure how we're gonna reference it. I need to discuss that with Sean how that needs to be done. But I referenced several Savage Worlds in the book several times, even though I mean we've drifted very far away from Savage World at this point. The ease of use. I like how they use dice instead of like numbers that like mean very little.
Time is such an important resource, even though we are time light, but in the case of this where you have 40 days or so to do something, or you have 2 weeks to do something, weirdly gives that tension so that those dice those actual dice rolls when you're in these tense moments of success or failure could mean the difference between 2 days' work or 5 days' work.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
again, I use pretty big numbers because one time unit, or a block as it's called, is like 15 minutes. So an hour has, am I saying that correctly? 12. No, I'm saying that wrong. 4. So 4 blocks is an hour. Well, then you translate that to work days, that being 8 times 4. So you immediately get like in very high numbers. So I translate that to 1 hour of work relates to 1 resource, just to keep it simple. So 8 hours of work means 4 times 8 resources. And again, like, this is where the negotiation comes into play, where the game master will say, well, yeah, you have this amount of time, you've got this amount of resources because you have this factory at your disposal, which basically has everything you need to build a car. Because, it's a car factory. It would be more of a miracle if it doesn't have all the stuff that you require to build something. But yeah, you need to have like this amount of components of level 5 technology in order to make this thing fully functional. I think that's kind of like the way to go, and really say I'm pretty happy on how I managed to incorporate botch jobs in the system. For those who are familiar with Savage Worlds, probably know the wild die. We have that too. It's kind of like a backup die, so instead of throwing 1 die, you throw 2 dice and then the highest result counts. So that kind of prevents, that everything depends on like 1 dice roll, which I highly prefer. But yeah, it's also how the criticals are also connected to those dice, without getting too technical. But yeah, I managed to kind of have the idea of botch jobs, which is if you are running out of time, but you really need to have like a particular part of the vehicle built for it to work within specifications of the mission, you can trade in time for botch jobs. And so you can have like a vehicle that works, but its engine is underpowered, or the door gets stuck, or I don't know, the wind wipers don't work half the time, or and I actually managed to get that in without it feeling tacked on or forced. So I'm very, very happy with that result, that it kind of, eventually started to match together. And it's very much still, the tests work in the same way as all the other tests. And yeah, it is just, it's a lot of negotiation with the GM. Says, well, you want to work 5 days on something. Okay, give me 10 dice rolls. Again, it's supposed to be an event, so I think that 10 dice rolls is more than justified for so much work.
I think players love it when they build something and it works well, and that's all fun. And that's what they want to do, and they get rewarded by that. And you need that in game systems. On the other hand, you also need things to go dramatically wrong, because that's where a lot of interesting stuff happens. So most of the games I've run over the last 40 odd years, the best stuff has happened when the dice roll has crit failed.
Yeah.
The most exciting things have happened, most unpredictable things. So I'm really pleased to hear that you've got that sort of mechanic kind of like baked in. And the other thing to think about is, how do games masters, when they play in real life and or across virtual tabletops, represent these mechanics on screen? Can I represent the way that you're building something easily on a VTT, whatever my poison, whether that's Roll20 or Alchemy or all the various VTTs are out there? Is it easy for me to represent what's happening so that the players can make sense of it? If you get those things right, then it won't be a burden to players, and you'll have a rewarding system that also throws in the odd fun curveball.
Yeah,
That's a really big.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Tonic.
No, I was just going to comment on, and that's a big thing of those failures can become the most iconic moments. I remember playing Only War with some friends, and I was playing the Ogryn, and they somehow shoved me into a tank. And they're like, you have to operate the gun. And I'm like, don't make me operate the gun. I have the worst shooting. I am going to mess this up. No, it's fine. Just roll it. Completely ruined it. Blew up the turret of the brand new tank we had just stolen. Nearly killed the party. And you have that moment of the dumb brute character says, told you can't shoot. And everybody dies laughing.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, the role of the game master in making dice rolls relevant is also very important. In the skill check section, I make an example of a character climbing a tower. I already mentioned this example before with the climbing skill and the climber boy skill, and then being a contortionist. However, I also use in that example, well, let's say that one skill, one roll is just too boring. It's just too much of a nothing burger, like one roll and you made it to the end of the tower. So I suggest, okay, we'll make it multiple tests. Say that instead of making one roll to climb 15 feet, let's say that for every success that you roll is another 5 feet. So you have to make 3 successes. And then in my example, I say, well, as the character is climbing the tower, a guard is coming out for a smoke, but he hasn't noticed you yet. However, would you roll a failure, the guard starts to become suspicious of something. Would you roll another failure, you're caught. So it's kind of like that best 3 out of 5, what I mentioned. And if you roll a critical failure, well, you fall down the tower. So that's an example that I use, and I think for especially extended tests to add that additional excitement to it. Do something that is harmless at the start, at least, that has no real effect unless you start rolling failures. I think that's also a very important skill a GM has. That lock picking a door isn't exciting. But if you hear like footsteps coming down the hall, all of a sudden your lock picking skill is like, oh shit, now I need to roll successes. I think that's also a very important thing for the puppeteer in any game.
Well, I've been interested to learn more about how you're going to sort of like approach and how you are approaching building your game. I think if you try to make a Dieselpunk game with only the game mechanics of the 80s and the 90s, it would be a hideous mess. But the evolution of role-playing game mechanics has made it much more doable to get that sort of like flexibility without losing a sense of coherency in the game mechanics. And I think that's where the real crux is, particularly with games like Dune, which are super abstract, mega flexible. Players drift off mentally because they can't get their heads around the overly abstract mechanics. To games where everything's all laid out and it's far too number crunchy, and I just die of boredom playing effectively maths games. So my closing thoughts are, you've got to get it right in the sweet spot, and that sounds like what you're aiming for with Nightwatch, which is very encouraging.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I certainly got some food for thought for this. I mean, I think we're very much on line on what RPG should be. Now, my experience as game, I have not played role-playing games for the longest time. have GM'd Shadowrun a very long time ago. I tried some other systems, but especially with the GURP system, what Shadowrun's based on, the number crunching, like how many dice do I get to throw? That was something definitely that really got me out of it, and like all these like pointless discussions, and just like you said, the hyper focusing on numbers. That's something I just want to get away with. I want this to be a game that I want to play, and I noticed, especially when I was trying dice rolls for the combat system, I hated the +3s. It was like, you roll your dice and then you like add +3. It just didn't feel right in my head. And again, it also caused like all these balance issues. So I'm kind of like aiming for a system where as long as the players have enough bullets, I mean that's gonna probably be the number crunchy, but you can solve that with dice essentially. But as long as you have bullets, you are very powerful. The moment your bullets are gone, you're done. So I mean how game masters and players want to deal with the ammo, that's up to them. But I do notice that as long as players have ammo, they are very powerful as it stands right now. I'll try and send you something you can try out this week for the combat system, so we can hopefully start refining that. So what else?
I think maybe for the next session, why don't we just go over like a character creation? Because there's a lot of unique mechanics we've had in there.
Yeah, yeah. We need to this weekly. We definitely need to get the skills done. Get the skill list work done. I'll send you the list so we can go over that. So yeah, that's gonna be my closing statement for now. I have some announcement after Miskatonic is done. What are your
I'm excited to talk more about this and start sharing what we've been obsessing over for a while now.
Yeah. Before then, I'll go into the announcements. Like for me, it's a bit of a race against the clock because we want to have a presentable, quick start book for Spiel, which is in the start of October. In that time, we also want to start with the Kickstarter for Night Watch, which of course I hope you'll subscribe to. We already have our pre-launch page up, which is association.official.com/ks, or go to the link underneath the video thing. DenizenRPG will also link in the video below as well. Also have STLs. I really should put those on Gumroad for you to download, so you can print your own miniatures. And the more miniatures all you guys will buy, the sooner I can start commissioning more. Yeah, that's just the way it is. I mean, it's the miniature thing is a bit more of a vanity thing, but people do love them. And we also have now a special edition of the Steampunk Mecha, and I of course definitely want to have more variations of that as well. So yeah, go check out, buy our books of course and stuff. Every little bit, everything we make at the moment all goes to our illustrators, 3D designers, and what have you. And of course you can support the project permanently like Miskatonic is already doing on REAM Stories. So all the links will be down below. And now usually I like to end my podcast with like some words of wisdom of our guests. So Steve, do you have some words of wisdom to share with our audience?
Oh, no pressure. Words of wisdom. If you're playing role-playing game and it's not fun, you're not enjoying yourself, then go and do something else. That's what role-playing games should be at the heart of it. Yes, a bit of escapism, but basically it's got to be fun. If you don't get joy out of it, then what are you doing playing it?
With that, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to bid you adieu. And as always, make things your way. Good night.